This is Dr. Rodriguez. I am going over Chapter 1 of Psychology 101. You should have in front of you a blank copy of the lesson notes or the chapter outline, and add in the extra notes that I have as we go through it. So Chapter 1 starts off by defining psychology and explaining why we study it. So what is psychology? Psychology is the scientific study of mind and behavior. Scientific study refers to using the scientific method, going about and studying our thoughts and our behaviors in a step-by-step way so as to reduce bias. So it's scientific study, meaning uses a scientific method. And the steps of the scientific method include having a topic of interest or a question in mind that you want to find out more about, and coming up with a hypothesis or an educated guess as to what you think might happen if you study the phenomenon that you're interested in. And then you go and you create a study. You test out the hypothesis to see if it is supported by the data or not. And then you get the data back, you get the results back, and you publish those results, or you present those results to professionals in the field so that they can then try to replicate the study and add to the knowledge in the field of psychology. So part of that testing of the hypothesis involves gathering empirical data. Empirical data means getting numbers or words. Data it can be numbers or words that you get by observing or measuring something. Maybe through an observation or doing a survey or an experiment or a number of other different types of research methods that we're going to talk about in Chapter 2. But for now, I just need you to know that psychology, so anytime you see ology, it means the study of our psyche, the study of our mind, the study of behavior. And it involves a scientific method where you study you test out a hypothesis. We study psychology to gain a better understanding of ourselves and others. By studying psychology, I hope that you will gain more critical thinking and a better ability to evaluate information. Any science that you take, including this psychology as a social science, it encourages you to be very skeptical of any information that you that you read or that you hear. It hopefully will encourage you to say, why do you think that? Or why do you believe that to be true? What is it based on? So psychology will help you to be kind of just question information and figure out if the information is reliable, valid, useful. Psychology can help you become a better communicator. It gives you words to be able to describe your own experience and the experience of others. And psychology also helps to give you a better appreciation for how complex behavior is. It's all behavior is a combination of our biology and our experiences. Our genes and the environment around us are what shape behavior. Psychology helps us to better understand that. The second part of the chapter looks at the history of psychology. Now, psychology is a relatively young field. It wasn't until the mid to late 1800s that psychology became a formal field of study. Before that, people would try to understand human behavior using religion or superstition before the Age of Enlightenment. And then after the Age of Enlightenment, look more towards the sciences. So before the Age of Enlightenment, it was more like religion, superstition, or philosophy. And after the Age of Enlightenment, it was more like, hey, how are we going to measure? What's the scientific explanation for whatever's happening? So some examples of religion or superstitious explanations for human behavior was that maybe if somebody was acting abnormal, they might believe that it's because of evil spirits or demons, and they might recommend drilling a hole in a person's skull to let out the evil spirit. All right. Or if somebody was acting abnormal, especially women, there was this belief that they were witches and that they needed to be hung. All right. So those were the explanations for abnormal behavior before psychology, before science became as important as it is today. And early scientists who studied human behavior were often medical doctors, or they were philosophers that had ideas about how human behavior worked. All right, so one of the first theories in psychology, I think of theories as a bunch of people sitting around a table offering their take on something, all right? And so in the early days of psychology, religion was used to give an explanation, right? Or philosophy was used. Later on, you had doctors coming out and saying, hey, I think this is actually what is happening. And one of the first psychologist, the first person to have a lab that actually focused on behavior and thought was Wundt, all right? And so the W sounds like a V in the way that you pronounce it, so Wundt. Now, the way that I remember Wundt is that I think, do you want to come and study psychology in my lab? So I imagine saying it like that almost kind of sounds like, I don't know, like Dracula. Do you want to come and study psychology in my lab? And so he was one of the first people to say, hey, if we're going to study human beings and their experience, we need to be doing it in a systematic way in a lab. So he had the first lab, and he really wanted to break down the structure, the pieces of conscious experience. And some of the things he focused on was like reaction time. And he would bring people into the lab and ask them to do some introspection. Introspection refers to introspection. So spection is like inspecting, right? Intro, kind of like internal, right? So, so examining one's own experience. So introspection. So he might say, all right, now when I rub this feather down your arm, explain to me what you are experiencing. So he used introspection to start to study human behavior. Now, Titchener was a student of Wundt, and he continued to move forward this idea that, we can break down the conscious experience, what we're thinking, into tiny little bits so that we can better understand it. And you see this picture over here. It's the structuralists. So Wundt and Titchener. So Titchener, developed structuralism, but Wundt, he said, he started it without giving it the name. And they both wanted to break down the structure, the pieces of the conscious experience. So he might be like thinking like this part of the brain is about self-esteem, or this one's about that. And, later on we learned that it's not quite as easy as that is pointing to one piece of a brain and saying that that's what it's all about. But this is how, psychology started, was structuralism, the desire of Wundt and Titchener to break down the structure of the human conscious experience. All right. Now, another theory that came about after structuralism was functionalism. And this one was based on Darwin's work. Darwin's work had to do with, survival of the fittest. We have behavior because it serves a function. It helps us to survive. It helps us to reproduce. So James was a person that brought psychology to the US. So whenever I think of James, I think of, okay, James is a first name or a last name that you might hear a lot more in the US compared to Vaunt, you know? So whenever I see James, I'm like, oh yeah, that sounds like a name that you'd be more likely to hear in the US compared to Vaunt. So Vaunt, he was the father of psychology, but James was the father of psychology in the US. And James said, rather than break down the structure of conscious belief, he focused more on the function of behavior. What function or purpose does a behavior serve? So looking at this picture, the baby crying, so James might say a baby cries because it serves a function. It gets the mother's attention so that the mother will then, or the parent will then feed the child so that it can then survive to be able to reproduce. So James focused more on the functions of human behavior, and functionalism later became evolutionary, or is similar to evolutionary theory. Another theory is the psychoanalytic theory, or approach to psychology, and that's Freud's theory. He came out and was saying, hey, behavior is a result of unconscious feelings and urges. These are conflicts that are going on inside of our head that we're not even aware of. He used the word id, ego, superego, which we're going to talk about more in later chapters, but the id says, I want sex, I want to eat, I want to do all these things. And when we have other parts of our unconscious that say, no, you can't do that, that's not okay. So Freud said that our behavior is the result of unconscious feelings and urges that we don't have an awareness to, and that we need to gain awareness of these conflicts so that we can resolve problems. And we can do that through dream analysis, slip of the tongue, like Freudian slips, free association, which is, talking about your problems uninterrupted. And we're going to talk a lot more about these different terms in later chapters. Now, Freud said that early childhood experiences are very important. He put a lot of emphasis on development before teen years. He said, we're pretty much well developed by our teen years. Later theories of development are going to say, no, we keep on developing. But Freud placed a lot of emphasis on the unconscious and on early childhood. Now, Freud's theory is very controversial to some, and some of that having to do with because it's very sex focused. He has the psychosexual stages that we'll go over later. In those stages, he might talk about penis envy and the Oedipus complex, where little boys are in love with and want to have sex with their mothers, and there's a lot in Freud's theory that some are going to be like, what the heck is that all about? But you need to understand that Freud did his work during the Victorian age, and it was a very sexually repressed time, especially for women. They were not supposed to enjoy sex or really have sexual urges. They were supposed to be, very pure. And Freud was seeing a lot of upper class women who had a lot of time in their hands, and were, coming in and talking about their sexual urges and their dreams that they were having. And so Freud was getting some, a lot of sexual information from his clientele, because they were living in a time where they weren't supposed to be sexual beings, and we are sexual beings, so they had to repress a lot of their urges. But later psychologists that placed a lot of emphasis on the unconscious conflicts, they placed less emphasis on it being so sex focused, and their theories became the psychodynamic. So it's similar to psychoanalytic. It's a lot about the unconscious, but the psychodynamic, the more modern Freud theories, are less sex focused. Now, Freud, even though he's controversial, he's important in psychology because he helped to bring about talk therapy, right? He placed a lot of emphasis on childhood experiences, and these unconscious conflicts that we need to bring to the conscious level. So although Freud talked a lot about sex, and some of his stuff, seems a little like, what? He did offer a lot to the field of psychology, and that's why we continue to learn about him.